The atmosphere of the colony world, Harvestroman 4, was usually a pale, comforting lavender, a result of the high xenon content in the upper stratosphere interacting with the light of the local K-type star. It was a peaceful sky for a peaceful people, farmers mostly, terraformers, families who had left the crowded arcologies of Earth to find a patch of soil they could call their own. They were not soldiers. They were not warriors. They were barely even armed, possessing only the rudimentary kinetic rifles needed to fend off the local predatory fauna. But when the sky burned, it did not matter what they were. It only mattered what they were about to become: dust. The Krael Imperial Armada did not broadcast a warning. They did not demand surrender. In the grand calculus of the Krael hegemony, lesser species were not afforded the dignity of a conversation. They were simply obstacles to be removed, resources to be harvested, or pests to be exterminated. High Admiral Zalcor stood on the bridge of his dreadnought, the Star Reader, and watched the main view screen with a bored expression on his chitinous face. His compound eyes flickered, taking in the tactical readouts that showed the orbital bombardment in real time. The human defense grid, a laughable collection of repurposed mining lasers and navigational shields, had evaporated in the first 3 seconds of the engagement. Now, it was just a matter of glassing the surface. Fire rained down, not the metaphorical fire of poetry, but the literal, physics-defying plasma of Krael-heavy batteries. Pillars of violet energy slammed into the planetary crust, punching through tectonic plates, vaporizing oceans, and turning cities into expanding clouds of superheated vapor. From orbit, it looked like the planet was blooming. Beautiful, deadly flowers of destruction opening up across the continents. Down below, millions of lives were extinguished before they could even process the horror of their end. Mothers clutching children, fathers shielding families, engineers trying to keep the power on, all of them reduced to carbon shadows against the melting concrete. Zalcor tapped a claw against the railing of his command dais. It was too easy. It was always too easy. The humans had expanded rapidly, yes, spreading like a virus across this sector, but they were soft. They talked of diplomacy, of trade, of alliances. They did not understand the fundamental truth of the galaxy: the strong devour and the weak are meat. He turned to his communications officer, a drone-cast Krael whose antennae twitched nervously. "Record this," Zalcor commanded, his voice a series of clicking rasps. "Send it to their homeworld. Send it to every frequency they monitor. Tell them that this is the price of encroachment. Tell them that the Krael hegemony claims this sector. Tell them to retreat to their mudball of a planet, or the sky over Earth will look just like the sky over Harvestroman 4. The message was sent. The video feed was high definition, unedited, and brutal. It showed the capital city of Harvestroman 4 crumbling into a caldera of magma. It showed the screams, filtered through the cold detachment of orbital sensors. And then it showed Zalcor's face, arrogant and unyielding. The Krael fleet lingered for a day, ensuring that nothing larger than a microbe survived on the surface, and then they engaged their warp drives, vanishing into the dark, confident that the message had been received. They expected fear. They expected panic. They expected the humans to beg for a treaty, to offer tribute, to cower. They did not understand what they had done. They did not know that humanity does not mourn with tears alone. Humanity mourns with silence, and in that silence we sharpen our knives. On Earth, the message was received. It played on the screens of Times Square, Tokyo, London, and the lunar colonies. It played in the Senate chambers of the Terran Federation. There was no panic. There were no riots in the streets. As the images of the burning colony played out, a strange phenomenon occurred. The noise of human civilization, the constant bickering of politics, the noise of commerce, the shouting of media simply stopped. People stood still in the streets, watching the destruction of their kin. They watched the alien admiral sneer at them. They listened to the translation of his clicking threats. And collectively, as a species, they went cold. President Elias Thorne sat in the Situation Room, the light of the holographic display reflecting in his eyes. He was an old man, a veteran of the resource wars of the previous century. He had seen death, but he had never seen genocide on this scale. The room was filled with generals and admirals, men and women who commanded the might of the United Earth Navy. They were silent, waiting for him to speak. Thorn looked at the frozen image of the burning planet. He looked at the casualty count, which had stopped updating because there was no one left to count. He took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice was not loud. It was terrifyingly calm. "Send a response," Thorn said to the communications director. The director's hands hovered over the console. What should it say? "Mr. President, should we ask for terms? Should we declare war?" Thorn shook his head slowly. "No terms, no declaration, just 2 words. The director typed them in. "Send it." The message was transmitted across the void, a narrow beam burst directed at the Krael homeworld coordinates. 2 words, "Message received." Then humanity went dark. The borders of Terran space were closed. Buoys were deployed, jamming frequencies, creating a wall of static around human space. Trade routes were severed. Diplomatic channels were cut. To the rest of the galaxy, it looked like humanity had retreated into a shell of fear, hiding from the Krael wrath. The Kraels celebrated. They toasted their victory with fermented nectar and mocked the cowardly apes who hid in the dark. Zalcor was promoted to High Warlord. The hegemony expanded, taking system after system, convinced that the local powers were too terrified to intervene. 6 months passed. Then a year. The memory of Harvestroman 4 began to fade for the galaxy, but it did not fade for Earth. Inside the Terran sphere, the economy had shifted overnight. Consumer goods were halted. Luxury manufacturing ceased. Every factory, every shipyard, every mine, and every laboratory was repurposed. The entire species mobilized with a singular, terrifying focus. They were not building a defense fleet. They were not building a retaliatory strike force. They were building an extinction event. The first sign that something was wrong came 18 months after the destruction of Harvestroman 4. A Krael listening post on the edge of the Veil Nebula reported a gravitational anomaly. It wasn't a ship. It was too big to be a ship. It was a mass reading equivalent to a small moon, moving at superluminal speeds. Then the signal cut out. Not jammed, ended. The post was gone. A scout squadron was sent to investigate. They arrived at the coordinates and found nothing. No debris, no wreckage, just empty space. It was as if the station had never existed. The scout commander reported a strange reading on his long-range sensors, a shadow, a patch of space where the stars seemed to be blocked out, shifting and moving like a living thing. Then his transmission ended in a burst of static. High Warlord Zalcor dismissed the reports as equipment failure or natural phenomena. He was busy planning the invasion of the Tyrell systems. He had no time for ghost stories, but the ghosts kept coming. A mining colony on the fringe of Krael space went silent. A heavy cruiser patrol vanished without a distress call. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Something was eating away at the edges of the Krael Empire. It was methodical. It was surgical, and it was completely silent. The fear began to creep in. Krael captains reported seeing things in the void, massive shapes that didn't reflect radar, ships painted in a black so deep it absorbed light, visible only by the absence of stars behind them. They called them the Void Walkers. Rumors spread through the lower decks. The humans, it had to be the humans, but the officers laughed. Humans were weak. Humans hid in their holes. Humans did not possess the technology to make a battleship disappear in a nanosecond. They were wrong. Humanity had not just advanced their technology, they had unlocked the physics of hate. They had cracked the code of singularity weaponry, of stealth systems that bent light around the hull, of kinetic drivers that accelerated tungsten rods to a fraction of the speed of light. They had built a fleet not designed to conquer, but to erase. The shadow fell upon the Krael core world of Zihar 3 weeks later. Zihar was a fortress world, the industrial heart of the hegemony. Protected by 3 orbital rings and a fleet of 200 capital ships, it was considered impregnable. The Krael fleet was on high alert, sensors sweeping the system. They detected nothing, no warp signatures, no heat blooms. The space around Zihar was empty, and then the sun went out. Panic erupted in the command centers on the surface. The solar arrays dropped to 0 output. The sky turned a bruised purple, then pitch black. The temperature began to plummet. On the bridge of the orbital defense station, the Krael commander stared at the viewscreen in horror. The sun, their life-giver, was gone, but it wasn't gone, it was blocked. A shadow had moved between the planet and the star, a shadow so massive it defied comprehension. Floodlights flickered on, searching the darkness. And there, hanging in the void, was the hull of a ship. But it wasn't just a ship. It was a monolith, a slab of armored black metal, 20 kilometers long and 10 kilometers wide, bristling with weapon emplacements that looked like city blocks. And it wasn't alone. As the Krael eyes adjusted, they saw them, hundreds of them, thousands, a wall of black steel that shadowed the entire sky. The Terran Armada had arrived. The communications channels, silent for 2 years, crackled to life. There was no image, just a voice, cold, synthetic, dead. "This is Admiral Stukov of the United Earth Navy ship Retribution. You burned our home. Now, we will blot out your stars." The Krael fleet opened fire. Thousands of plasma torpedoes streaked toward the wall of ships. They impacted the human shields and dissipated like rain on a windshield. The Terran ships did not fire back immediately. They simply waited, absorbing the hate, letting the Krael expend their energy. The psychological weight of it was crushing. The Krael were firing everything they had, and the humans were just watching. Then the response came. It wasn't a barrage. It was a pulse. The massive dreadnoughts synchronized their main batteries, gravity lances, beams of distorted spacetime that didn't burn but crushed. The Krael warships crumpled like tin cans. Hulls buckled, reactors went critical, and ships imploded into singularities of twisted metal. In minutes, the pride of the Krael Navy was reduced to a field of debris. The orbital rings were shattered, raining megatons of debris down onto the industrial centers below. But the humans did not glass the planet. That would be too quick. They maintained the blockade. They held their position, blocking the sun. The temperature on Zihar dropped. The crops froze. The solar power failed. The planet began to die a slow, cold death. The message was clear: you took our light. Now you will live in the dark. Zalcor, watching the reports from the safety of the homeworld, felt a sensation he had never experienced before: terror, true, primal terror. Humans were not just winning. They were dismantling the hegemony system by system. They didn't invade. They didn't occupy. They arrived, they destroyed the military capability, and then they parked a massive siege platform in orbit to block the star. They were turning Krael worlds into tombs of ice and darkness. The High Warlord rallied the Grand Fleet. Every ship, every reserve, every prototype was summoned to the Krael homeworld, Prime. If the humans wanted a fight, he would give them the greatest battle in galactic history. He amassed 10,000 ships, a swarm of destruction that could consume galaxies. They waited in orbit of Prime, weapons charged, ready to die for the glory of the hegemony. When the humans arrived at Prime, they didn't come out of warp at the edge of the system. They jumped directly into the gravity well, a maneuver that should have been suicidal, tearing ships apart with tidal forces. But the human ships held. They appeared in a flash of Cherenkov radiation, instantly surrounding the Krael fleet. And leading them was a ship that defied logic, the UNS Nemesis *. It was the size of a small continent. It didn't look like a ship. It looked like a jagged tear in the fabric of reality. Zalcor screamed the order to fire. The Krael fleet unleashed hell. The void was lit up with the fury of 10,000 suns. For a moment, it seemed like the humans would be overwhelmed by the sheer volume of fire. But as the smoke cleared, the Nemesis emerged, its shields flaring a brilliant gold, but unbroken. A hologram materialized on Zalcor's bridge. It was not a recording. It was a live feed. A human male, scarred, wearing a black uniform with no medals, only a simple patch of a burning flower, the symbol of Harvestroman 4. "I am High Admiral Vance," the human said. His voice was not shouting. It was conversational, which made it infinitely worse. "You are Zalcor, the Butcher of Harvest. I am the ruler of this galaxy," Zalcor shrieked, his mandibles clicking furiously. "You are vermin. I will burn your fleet. I will burn your Earth." Vance looked at him with eyes that looked like dead coal. You already tried that. You missed a spot. You left us alive. Vance turned to someone off-screen. Target the primary star. Initiate the Dyson protocol. Zalcor froze. Target the star. You cannot destroy a star. We aren't going to destroy it, Vance said, looking back at the alien warlord. We're going to turn it off. The Asterisk Nemesis Asterisk and the 12 other super-dreadnoughts of the Apocalypse class maneuvered into a geometric formation around the Krael sun. They deployed immense solar sails, not to catch wind, but to project a containment field. A suppression web. It was technology stolen from the very fabric of the universe, theoretical physics made manifest by a species driven by pure distilled rage. They began to siphon the star's corona, feeding the energy into their own capacitors and simultaneously dampening the fusion reaction within the core. The light of the prime sun began to redden. It shifted from a brilliant yellow-white to a dull, angry orange, then to a blood red. The temperature in the system plummeted. The Krael fleet, dependent on solar charge for their extended shielding, began to falter. The humans didn't even have to fire their main guns. They were strangling the system's power source. "You are monsters," Zalcor cried out, watching his world descend into twilight. "This is against all laws of war. Laws of war are for soldiers," Vance replied cold. "We are not soldiers anymore. We are consequences. You wanted to be the masters of the void? Fine. Embrace it." The human fleet opened fire then. With the Krael shields failing, it was a slaughter. The human railguns tore through the alien hulls like paper. The Asterisk Star Reader Asterisk, Zalcor's flagship, took a direct hit to its bridge. The last thing the High Warlord saw was the vacuum of space rushing in and the sight of his dying sun, choked by the shadows of human ships. The battle lasted 3 hours. The Krael hegemony lasted 3,000 years. It ended that day. Humans did not occupy Prime. They left the Dyson inhibitors in place, dimming the star permanently, leaving the Krael homeworld in a perpetual freezing twilight. A reminder, a monument. Humanity withdrew. They returned to their borders. They did not expand. They did not conquer the other races of the galaxy. They simply went back to their worlds, rebuilt their colonies, and stood watch. But the galaxy had changed. The other empires, the ones who had watched and done nothing, looked at the Terran borders with a new, profound fear. They realized that humanity was not a sleeping giant. A giant can be killed. Humanity was something else. They were a mirror. If you smiled at them, they smiled back. If you offered a hand, they shook it. But if you burned them, if you took from them, they would not just burn you back. They would extinguish your light. They would shadow your stars. They would ensure that your children's children grew up in the dark, telling stories of the day the humans came to collect their debt. Years later, a diplomat from the Galactic Council arrived at Earth, trembling, to establish a new trade treaty. He asked the Terran representative, "Why did you leave them alive in the dark? Why not just destroy them?" The Terran representative smiled, a sad, tired smile. "Because death is an escape. We wanted them to remember. Every time they look up at that dim, dying sun, they remember Harvestroman 4, and they remember that we are still out here, waiting." The diplomat nodded and signed the treaty without reading it. He understood. The galaxy understood. You can fight an army, you can fight an empire, but you cannot fight the dark. And humanity had become the masters of the dark. The stars over New Harvest are bright again. The lavender sky is peaceful. Children play in the fields, unaware of the monsters that once came from the sky. But their parents know. And in the shipyards of Jupiter, the black ships wait, silent and brooding, casting long shadows against the backdrop of infinity. Ready for the next fool who thinks humanity is weak. Ready to blot out the sky once more. Because the lesson was written in the cold vacuum of space, in the ruins of the Krael Empire, and in the history books of a dozen worlds. There are things in the universe that you do not touch. There are predators, and then there are the humans. And if you hear the silence coming from the Sol sector, pray to whatever gods you worship, because the shadow is listening.